Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Museum of Northern Arizona online. Today we got a group of presenters here who are going to be talking about Nagpra. We got Kim Spur, Hayes Gilpin, as well as Moana, who are all core members to M&A's anthropology team. So you guys feel free to welcome yourselves.
Thanks, Darvin. Welcome, everybody. Today we want to talk about a piece of legislation that went into effect about 30 years ago, and people are still really interested in this. It's called Nagpra, which stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I'll introduce myself. I'm the curator of anthropology at the Museum of Northern Arizona. I'm also an archaeologist and professor at Northern Arizona University. My name is Kelly Hayes Gilpin. So I'd like to start just with some framing to open the conversation. And I want to say, by starting out, I want to say that Nagpra is human rights legislation. It was passed by Congress into law in 1990, and a lot of us are still working very closely with the law and its implications. So this law applies to federal agencies and any organization or institution that receives federal funding. So if you get grants from the National Science Foundation as a university professor, then your institution is responsible for complying with this law. So the law provides guidance for the repatriation of human remains, which means the return of human remains, funerary objects, sacred and ceremonial objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. We'll talk about examples of repatriation to local tribes here in Northern Arizona under each of these categories that have been facilitated by the Museum of Northern Arizona since 1990. So when the law went into effect, the Museum of Northern Arizona went into action and got started on compliance, and we're still doing it 30 years later. I'll also note that it's an unfunded mandate. So that's one of the challenges we can talk about as we go along. So we want to start with some background on the development of Nagpra. And I want to introduce Moana Lomomvaya. She's a member of the Hopi tribe. And she has some pretty impressive academic credentials, including a BA and an MA from Northern Arizona.
So as Kelly just said, my name is Moana. I'm a member of the Hopi tribe from the village of Hopewell. I just graduated in April with my master's in anthropology from NIU. Right now, I'm just providing a brief history of archaeology in terms of the development of the archaeological profession, and then ultimately what led up to the development and passage of Nagpra. So in the context of the history of archaeological studies, many archaeologists have created a narrative of complete disconnect between indigenous peoples and their ancestors and ancestral homes that we today call archaeological sites. Since the early years of the development of archaeology in the US, archaeologists have forced a separation between the past and the present. When we think about early excavations of ancestral sites, beginning 1700s, 1800s, early excavation, especially in the Southwest, began as avocational activities, hobbies amongst people in various communities surrounding archaeological sites, and individuals who came across sites and wanted to explore them and figure out, what are these? Early on, these activities were carried out by individuals without formal archaeological training, such as with the Wetherells at Mesa Verde, or Thomas Jefferson at the mound sites on the East Coast. But as archaeology became a more solidified professional field, excavations, research, and collections became more structured and standardized in how to carry them out in a scientific manner. The disposition of these early collections and moving into when the field became more professionalized, many of these early collections ended up in private collections in museums or other collecting institutions across the United States. And many of these items found in these archaeological sites were put on display in exhibits that focused on indigenous people as simple and civilized, as fading into history as part of this old paradigm that was fading away. Many of these exhibits would often display culturally sensitive and sacred materials, as well as, unfortunately, often human remains as well. So looking at this long history and what kind of led to the development of calls for repatriation, for consultation and discussion, and giving a voice to Native people in terms of archaeology and the treatment of their culture, of their ancestors, of their past. The movement towards protection for Native American ancestral remains and materials, such as the cultural patrimony materials and the sacred objects materials Kelly briefly discussed. There was a call and an emphasis on collaboration and Indigenous voices that began and originated with the repatriation movement and the Native American activism beginning in the 1960s and 70s. Beginning in the 1970s, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, and other Native American groups, including student activists from various universities across the United States, began to focus on the issue of archaeological excavation, grave digging, and repatriation, developing protests and widespread attention around the issue of burial excavations of Native American ancestors for the study of anthropology and archaeology. Many in mainstream society, Indigenous communities, and archaeological communities, including AIM and scholar Vine Deloria Jr., recognize the need for self-reflection of the archaeological discipline and what we consider scientific research and the ethics around that. And the research focuses, and especially the treatment of ancestors and their descendants. In many of his works, but predominantly in Custer Died for Your Sins, Deloria, a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, called out anthropologists and archaeologists on their penchant for preying on and benefiting from research on Indigenous communities and Indigenous ancestors. Activism, critique, and initiative towards inclusion of Indigenous voices in archaeology and anthropology were all contributing factors to the development of Nagpra. One of the final pushes towards passage of Nagpra were the efforts of Maria Pearson concerning Native American burials found during a historic cemetery relocation in Iowa in the 1970s. Maria, a Yankton, Dakota activist, found out that during a historic cemetery relocation by the Iowa Department of Transportation, in which both white and Native American burials were found, the Native American burials were treated differently than those of the white individuals. While the white burials have been immediately buried in their new location, the Native American burials were taken to a lab for research and study. Maria took this issue to the government's office and finally met with him after she sat in his office in her full traditional attire. And upon talking to him and him asking her, "What can I do for you?" she said, quote unquote, "You can give me back my people's bones, you can quit digging them up." Her actions led to the passage of the Iowa Burials Protection Act in 1976, which was the first ever legislative act passed in the United States, which specifically provided protections for Native American remains. After this success, Maria went on to become an activist and lobbyist for the creation and passage of Nagpra, and she later became known as the Rosa Parks of Nagpra.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Spur. I am the Archaeology Division Director at the Museum in Northern Arizona. And I'm someone who has been working with Nagpra very closely since it passed in 1990, having been in graduate school at the time, and was cautioned by some colleagues to stay away from all issues relating to Nagpra because I'd never have a job. And in fact, it has brought me a lot of satisfaction to work with the tribal communities and to implement this law, which is, as Kelly said, it's a really important piece of human rights legislation. So I'm going to give you a basic overview of Nagpra, the sort of the nuts and bolts, the administrative boring stuff, how it applies and how it's actually undertaken. Nagpra applies to human remains, funerary objects, sacred and ceremonial objects, and objects of cultural patrimony that come from federal lands and tribal lands. It requires compliance from all federal agencies, and as Kelly pointed out, all museums and other repositories or institutions that receive federal funding. So Nagpra does not apply to private land or state land. However, most states have enacted very similar laws that do apply to private lands and state lands, and particularly apply to human remains and funerary objects. When NAGPRA was passed in 1990, it included a requirement that any federal agency and any institution that held items that were subject to NAGPRA, that they had to submit an inventory, a summary inventory of all objects in their repositories by 1997. Most agencies and institutions did in fact submit inventories at the time by 1997, but they tended to be very, very short, rather disorganized, hard to use, because the law didn't really specify exactly how the form of those inventories, or whether tribes had to be consulted. It was really a one-sided attempt where institutions just went through, and anything they thought the tribes might be interested in, they put on the inventories and submitted. But there was a report in 2010 that was issued by the Government Accountability Office that addressed the actual compliance. And it pointed out that very, very few government agencies or museums or universities had actually done anything close to the compliance that's required, both in law and in word and in spirit, by NAGPRA. And this resulted in a huge outcry among tribal communities and among those people in the archaeological and academic and museum communities who had been pushing for more compliance. Quick little basic how it works. The process of reporting is not straightforward, and it does take a while to figure out how to do this. Human remains and funerary objects get inventoried and they get reported on one set of reports, whereas there's a slightly separate process and a different reporting format for sacred and ceremonial objects and objects of cultural patrimony. Once the inventories are submitted, they go to the National Park Service, who has a NAGPRA division. Inventories are verified, questions are resolved, and then these inventories get published in the Federal Register so that they are legal documents that are publicly available. The agency or museum is also responsible for contacting the tribes to whom these are likely to be repatriated, and then the tribes claim whatever the objects are, and repatriation can then occur. And I think that's one thing, that's one of the sort of main things that we have all learned over the last 30 years, is that this isn't a checklist to be completed by agencies, federal agencies, museums, universities. This really should be a collaborative effort among those institutions and the tribes, because the tribes are the ones that are going to benefit from this legislation.
So I'm just going to briefly talk about the negative results of NAGPRA as we know them to exist 30 plus years after NAGPRA was passed. So with NAGPRA, there are some continued colonial and paternalistic views among archaeologists and museum staff. I think that this kind of goes back to the idea that NAGPRA is a Western legal framework. It is in the European style of how we know law to be, how we know property ownership to be, all these concepts that don't necessarily align with Native and Indigenous cultures and how they think of the world and everything in it. So you have that incompatibility on that level, where it is ancestral Indigenous items, people you are dealing with repatriating within a less Western legal framework that doesn't align or doesn't conceptualize or understand how things work in whatever culture or Indigenous tribe it may be. And by those means, all of the tribes in the United States, people across the world, but especially tribes in the United States, are so different. Kim said from the beginning, there were no outlined specific rules or how-tos on how to conduct your compliance, how to publish an inventory, what the inventory was supposed to look like. This is something that we've kind of developed the framework for conducting and writing inventories and writing all of these different documents through practice, through doing this over the past 30 years. This is how we've been able to learn how to do these things is by doing them. You can't just have one uniform law that applies to everybody and everything gets done in an easy and efficient way. Nagpra is a slow process. It takes years to conduct one repatriation. Consultations take a long time just because everybody is trying to do so many different things. People get overwhelmed, and it's bottom line, it's a long process. It's not efficient. But we work towards these things and keep going because the end goal is to see that repatriation happen. So there's still issues with NAGPRA that we see, we identify, and we learn more about as we get more into practicing NAGPRA.
This has really benefited scholarship too, with increasing our understanding as cultural outsiders and as scientists. This process of having the conversations has really improved our understanding of cultural contexts and views and traditions and connections and kinship and all of these things that anthropology is supposed to be about, but used to be a more insider-outsider colonial enterprise. It's now much more collaborative and conversational, and that really makes better science as well as much better human relationships and results. So one of those results is the development of, I guess, a kind of archaeology that has been described as indigenous archaeologies, plural, because as Moana said, not everybody does it the same way in the community or does science the same way. And now we have an increase in indigenous people practicing archaeology and coming into the university system. So not only going to, say, the University of Hopi to learn from elders and the language and the ethics and the worldview at home, but also coming to a university like at AU and learning to do the science as well, so that you can take those techniques back home and use them for the community's own purposes. And some of those purposes have to do with land and water claims, mapping out oral histories and migrations, and relationships over very large swaths of territory. There's a lot of research going on now about ancient trade routes and travel routes and migrations all the way into Mesoamerica and even further south. So some really big questions that are being looked at with oral histories, with indigenous ways of knowing about the world and the way the world works. Traditional ecological knowledge is being brought to bear on questions of climate change and sustainability, and how did people react to droughts in the past and how do they react now. We've had a Zuni stabilization crew out at ancient ancestral Hopi and Zuni site called Chavez Pass near Flagstaff, working on erosion control using traditional methods for controlling erosion. So little rock dams and woven check dams and channeling water, slowing it down, building up soil for gardens. So all of these things are starting to come together. And I'm not saying everything's perfect, but there are these new streams of ways of knowing and ways of collaborating and working together that I'm very excited about.
So in terms of Nagpra compliance and the process of Nagpra, we thought we'd give you some concrete examples from the Museum in Northern Arizona. M&A serves as a repository for multiple federal agencies. So we hold collections that are legally, there's an important distinction. So legal control is held by an agency, usually the agency who owns the land where these objects came from, versus possession, which is the actual physical um, having those objects. So M&A has possession, but the federal agency has legal control, which means that the federal agency is the one who is responsible for compliance under NAGPRA, also is responsible for notifying tribes, making sure the notices get published, all of that. And they are ultimately responsible for the repatriation of the items or the human remains. This is not something that M&A is responsible for, but because we do hold these objects as a repository, we facilitate that compliance with NAGPRA because we have on staff people who have the expertise, the knowledge, the experience, and equally as important, the museum has long-term, long-standing relationships with regional tribes that we've developed through the course of NAGPRA, but going back to the 20s when the museum was established. I will speak partly because I am in the archaeology division and we do a lot of the work for repatriation of human remains and funerary objects. And then Kelly's going to talk more about the other categories of objects. Over the past 10 years or so, M&A has been involved in the repatriation of approximately 1,200 sets of human remains, ancestors, and about probably close to 40,000 funerary objects. So that gives you a sense of the scale of these repatriations. If you there's a website that's hosted by the National Park Service, the National NAGPRA office, and they have a database of repatriations, and the number of items that have been repatriated in the last 30 years is honestly sort of stunning. It's kind of amazing. The museums aren't empty yet, but it just goes to show how much of the heritage of the tribes are being held outside of tribal communities. Again, repatriation, the process takes several years because what M&A does when we're approached by a federal agency, for instance, the Forest Service, who might come to us and say, we know you hold X number of sets of human remains and funerary objects that were collected, excavated, removed from Forest Service land, and we want to start the process of repatriation. The first thing we would do is go through, verify the inventory, exactly where all of those came from, exactly that we have records, and because the tribes will want to know these specific things. The other things that tribes need to know in order to appropriately rebury and send these ancestors to continue their journey is they need to know, for instance, the age at death and the sex of an individual, because that's an important part of the reburial ceremony. So that also has to be compiled, that information. The funerary objects are can be studied to provide, again, more information about where they came from, where they were developed. So it's a way of helping tribes look at where their ancestors were moving around, who they were interacting with, who they were trading with. And these are questions that have been developed in collaboration with the tribes. They're things that the tribes want to know about these objects before they get repatriated.
And I'll start with cultural patrimony. What that means is that an object belongs to a community. It doesn't belong to an individual. It can't be sold by an individual. An individual may sell it on the market, and this happened a lot in the past when times were really hard. The 1918 flu epidemic is a really good example of a time when things were really hard. Many of these objects that are owned communally are also used in ceremonies, and that's the definition of sacred and ceremonial objects. They're necessary for the ongoing practice of a particular ceremony. So cultural patrimony might be items that are used within, by the whole community within a ceremony, or by individuals who are performing a ceremony for the benefit of the community, but they don't actually own them as individuals. And then sacred and ceremonial objects can be owned by individuals, but they're used in particular ceremonies. So one example that I think is okay to talk about is an enemy way drum that was acquired by the museum at some point in the past. And then when the Nagpra consultations happened and the Navajo Nation representatives came to the museum to see some of the items that were reported on our inventory, they were able to identify a drum as something that's needed to perform what is called in English an enemy way ceremony. It's a healing ceremony that's often used for returning veterans, and many members in the community benefit from this ceremony. It's been practiced for hundreds of years, and these drums are necessary for the performance of that ceremony. So this drum was repatriated under Nagpra through that process. Another process that of repatriation that MNA and other museums engage in is not through Nagpra, through the legal process itself, but voluntary return, which is also repatriation in that something is going back to its home community. And an example of this was we had an intern from the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community in the valley who recognized Hohokam pottery in some of our archaeological collections. And she said, hey, why does MNA have Hohokam material here? That's out of scope. We're a museum of the Colorado Plateau. And you know that the Pima Maricopa community has its own museum now. So after completing Nagpra on those materials, on the human remains and funerary objects, MNA voluntarily returned the non-mortuary materials. So even materials that weren't covered by law returned to the descendant community voluntarily so that their own community could handle those items in whatever way is most culturally appropriate.
Yeah. So I guess lastly on my part, I just kind of want to say that repatriation is such an important process for archaeologists within the discipline, but also obviously for tribal communities. When we think about kind of the history of archaeology and how we're handling that today and trying to remedy kind of that, kind of do some kind of reconciliation process, beginning that process within our own discipline. A lot of these processes were not ethically or morally correct in what they did. It may not have been something that was recognized 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago, but we do recognize that, and we do recognize the harm that has done to descendant communities, but to these people themselves. And we have to remember that these aren't just items, these aren't just remains, they're not just cultural objects. These were and still are to indigenous communities. They're still living, breathing people. These are individuals, they're people. So it is our responsibility to remedy that harm and as best we can, because there's no complete way to fix what archaeologists and history and colonialism has done. But this is one way of trying to help.
You know, I think we are just about done. Thank you guys so much for giving this informal presentation. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you for all of your hard work.
Okay.
Anything else for our viewers out there?
Have a great day.
All right. Well,
Thanks,
again, thank you for
everybody.
joining us. All right. Well, we'll see you guys later. I'll see you in the offices.
Looking forward to it.
All right.
Thank
you guys.
you.